Every calculation, every plan, every hope for a decisive breakthrough evaporated with the simple, terrifying fact the tanks were empty. The Ardennes Offensive, meticulously prepared for months, had hit a wall, not of enemy fire, but of scarcity. Colonel Hans Piper, commanding the spearhead, walked among his immobilized vehicles. His eyes scanned the stalled engines, the frustrated crews, and the frozen ground ahead. The soldiers were trained to believe in German engineering and the invincibility of their armored units, but the reality in front of them was impossible to ignore. Even the mightiest weapon could be rendered useless without the most basic resource, fuel. The tension was palpable. Men exchanged nervous glances, whispers of fear spreading through the ranks faster than the morning mist. The strategic advantage they had hoped to wield, the element of surprise, and their elite training all meant nothing in the face of an empty fuel tank. The Ardennes, a region chosen for its potential to deliver a crippling blow to the Allies, now felt like a frozen trap. For the American audience, it's almost unimaginable. These were some of the best trained soldiers in history, operating the most advanced tanks of the time, and yet they were brought to a standstill by a problem that seems almost mundane: running out of gasoline. The lesson is immediate and striking. In modern warfare, even the most powerful weapons are only as effective as the resources that fuel them. Strategy, courage, and training can only take a force so far if the logistical foundation crumbles beneath them. The scene sets the stage for what would become a turning point in the Ardennes. It is not just the story of stalled tanks, but the story of the larger lesson the German soldiers would learn that day: that the enemy they faced was not only disciplined and skilled, but astonishingly abundant. America's ability to produce, supply, and sometimes even waste resources at a scale Germany could not imagine would become painfully clear in the days to come. This is where the story of December 1944 begins. The frozen fields of Belgium, the stalled tigers, and the bewildered soldiers standing in their shadows serve as a stark reminder. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't the tank, the gun, or the soldier. It's the industrial might that keeps the war machine running. And on that morning, the Germans would see, in a way they never expected, just how far behind they truly were. After the chilling scene of stalled Tiger tanks, it's important to understand what the Germans were attempting. The Battle of the Ardennes, more famously known as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. Codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, this offensive aimed to punch through the Ardennes forest, split the Allied forces, and recapture the critical port of Antwerp. Success here could have forced the Allies into chaos, buying Germany time to regroup and possibly negotiate a favorable peace. The stakes could not have been higher. At the heart of this assault was Colonel Hans Piper, a 29-year-old prodigy of the Waffen SS, already decorated with the Knight's Cross for his service on the Eastern Front. He commanded one of the most elite armored units in the Wehrmacht. His soldiers were veterans, highly trained, and ready to execute complex maneuvers with precision. These were men who had fought through mud, snow, and relentless enemy fire. They believed in the power of their tanks and the might of German engineering. They were prepared for almost anything except the reality that would soon confront them in Belgium. Fuel, which may seem ordinary today, was the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. The Tigers, Panthers, and other armored vehicles relied on it entirely. Without it, they were no more than heavy metal statues, impressive in design but useless in action. For Piper and his men, fuel was more than a resource. It was the key to mobility, to executing their plan, and to survival itself. Every mile consumed precious gallons, every idling engine burned reserves, and every miscalculation could be catastrophic. The soldiers were exhausted, the vehicles strained, and morale was fragile. Piper's orders were clear. Every drop of fuel had to be conserved. Engines shut down when not moving, and capturing American supply depots became the top priority. Victory now depended on seizing the enemy's abundance, a risky gamble born of necessity. For the audience, this is where the drama sharpens. Imagine being an elite soldier, trained for combat, armed with the best technology of the time, and yet facing a threat more subtle and unforgiving than any bullet or shell: running out of fuel. In the middle of an offensive, the story of the Ardennes is not just about tanks or courage. It is about the stark difference between two warring nations, one operating with scarcity and desperation, the other fueled by industrial might and seemingly limitless resources. Colonel Piper and his men advanced, confident in their strategy, but already constrained by the invisible hand of logistics. Every vehicle, every maneuver, Every moment of idling had a cost measured in gallons of fuel. For the German soldiers, it was a lesson they could not ignore. In modern warfare, courage and skill are vital, but they are nothing without the resources to sustain them. The Ardennes would soon become a battlefield, where the Germans' lack of fuel would define the outcome more than any act of heroism or tactical brilliance. This introduction sets the stage for what comes next. The moment when Piper's unit discovers the American fuel depot at Hansfeld, a stockpile so vast it makes their own reserves seem laughably small. It is here, in the freezing forests of Belgium, that the true scale of America's industrial power becomes clear, and the Germans realize they are fighting an enemy whose war machine operates on a scale they can scarcely comprehend. As Colonel Hans Piper and his elite SS unit pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the winter morning fog cloaked both danger and revelation. The German offensive had already slowed, their Tiger tanks struggling through narrow forest paths, engines burning precious fuel with every mile. Morale was tense, and every soldier knew the stakes. Then, as they crested a small rise near the village of Hansfeld, they saw something that made even the most hardened veterans stop in their tracks. Spread out before them, in neat rows that seemed to stretch endlessly, were thousands of American jerry cans, filled to the brim with gasoline. 50,000 gallons of high-octane fuel had been left behind by retreating American forces. For the Germans, this was no ordinary supply depot. It was a spectacle that defied their understanding, a bounty so enormous it seemed almost unreal. Tanks, half-tracks, and armored vehicles stood idle nearby, their crews gawking at the sheer volume of fuel, knowing that in Germany, even a fraction of this amount would have been guarded with entire divisions. Piper's men moved cautiously at first, their trained instincts warning them that such abundance might be a trap. But as the first cans were pried open, the sweet, sharp scent of high-octane gasoline filled the cold air. Engines roared back to life, and for a brief, euphoric moment, it seemed that the German advance could continue unimpeded. Soldiers began refueling their tanks and vehicles frantically, their faces a mix of disbelief and sheer joy. It was as if they had stumbled upon a treasure beyond imagination, a prize that promised to change the course of their offensive. But the astonishment ran deeper than just the practical value of fuel. For these elite soldiers, trained to measure every resource and ration every drop, the sight of such abundance was almost incomprehensible. Their war experience had been defined by scarcity. In the bitter winters on the Eastern Front and the desperate campaigns across Europe, every gallon of fuel had been precious, every mile a carefully calculated risk, and here, before them, lay tens of thousands of gallons that Americans could afford to abandon without a second thought. It was a reality that shook their understanding of the enemy. Piper himself walked among the stacks of jerry cans, counting and assessing the bounty. His mind raced as he considered what this meant for the offensive. With this fuel, his units could push farther than ever before. They could reach objectives that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. But beneath the excitement lurked a dawning realization. The Germans were used to fighting with what they had. They captured fuel out of necessity, never imagining an enemy who had so much that they could leave it behind without fear. It was not just a resource, it was a statement of industrial power and organizational might. For the audience, the impact of this discovery is easy to imagine. Picture standing in a frozen forest, knowing that your next mile of movement, your ability to engage the enemy, even your life depends entirely on the fuel you have, and then seeing a seemingly endless sea of it, enough to power hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and armies beyond counting. For the German soldiers, it was both exhilarating and terrifying. The exhilaration came from the immediate tactical advantage. The terror came from understanding that the Americans could make such supply dumps at will, and more importantly, could destroy or move them just as easily. This moment at Hansfeld was more than just a lucky find. It was a window into the vast machinery of the American war effort. It revealed a nation whose industrial and logistical power dwarfed Germany's ability to fight mechanized warfare. For Piper's men, the 50,000 gallons were both a prize and a warning. It was a treasure that reminded them that they were no longer fighting a war measured in gallons and rations, but a war against an opponent whose abundance made German scarcity irrelevant. By the end of that day, the discovery at Hansfeld would be talked about in hushed tones among German ranks. They had witnessed a scale of power they could scarcely believe, a lesson that would resonate long after the Ardennes offensive ended. For the audience, this is the moment where the story shifts, from a desperate military push to a revelation about the true nature of industrial warfare. where logistics and production often determine victory more than courage or tactics. As Colonel Hans Piper's soldiers refueled their tanks at Hansfeld, the initial excitement slowly gave way to a sobering realization. What seemed like a miracle that captured 50,000 gallons of American gasoline suddenly revealed the true scale of the war they were fighting. In Germany, an entire division might scrape together just enough fuel to operate for a few weeks. Yet here, in this small Belgian village, the Americans had left behind a single supply depot that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht could imagine. It was not just a question of quantity, it was a revelation of industrial might. Piper's men began to grasp the numbers. The fuel they held in their hands, which had felt like a treasure moments ago, was in fact only a fraction of what the Americans had at their disposal. As they surveyed the stacks of jerry cans stretching as far as the eye could see, the enormity of the United States production and logistical network became clear. For every tank they refueled, for every mile they could now advance, the Americans had reserves that made German scarcity seem absurd. This was a moment when sheer quantity spoke louder than training or courage. The soldiers could not hide their disbelief. A veteran like Piper, who had survived the brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front, understood better than most that modern warfare depended on more than just tanks, bullets, and bravery. It depended on fuel, supplies, and the ability to move men and machines continuously. And here, staring at this depot, he realized the stark truth. The Americans were operating on a scale Germany could not match. One village, one captured depot, held enough gasoline to keep entire German divisions running for months. Germany's meticulous planning, rationing, and desperate calculations suddenly seemed trivial in comparison. The psychological impact on the troops was immediate. For years, German soldiers had been told they were the elite, the best trained and most disciplined army in the world. They prided themselves on resourcefulness and precision, carefully calculating every liter of fuel and every mile of movement. Yet now they faced a country that could produce, transport, and even destroy fuel in quantities beyond comprehension. They were not just outmatched in technology or tactics, they were outnumbered by abundance itself. For the audience, it's easy to imagine the scene. German Tiger tanks, once symbols of unstoppable power, stood silently, waiting for fuel from the Americans. Soldiers measured every drop they had fought so hard to capture, while the Americans had reserves they could afford to burn rather than let them fall into enemy hands. It was a lesson in scale that shook the German soldiers to their core. Germany thought it was in control, as Piper later reflected. Then reality hit like a wall. Even more striking was how quickly this realization spread among the German ranks. Private soldiers, NCOs, and officers alike began comparing their supplies with the Americans' astonishing reserves. They understood that capturing fuel depots would never be enough. Even if they seized every drop in the Ardennes, they would still be running on the edge of exhaustion while the Americans simply replenished what they lost. This imbalance made every German tactical victory hollow, every advance precarious. The odds were no longer in their favor, and the war, at least in terms of industrial capacity, was slipping irreversibly away. Piper himself could see it clearly. His elite SS unit, trained for precision strikes and fast maneuvers, now realized that no amount of skill could overcome the fundamental mismatch. The Americans had built a machine of supplies so vast that even German planning could not keep pace. Every refueled tank was a temporary advantage. Every mile gained a brief illusion. The real power belonged not to the men or their weapons, but to the industrial engine that fed them. This moment at Hansfeld was more than a tactical discovery. It was an education in the nature of modern warfare. The Germans had fought hard. This moment at Hansfeld was more than a tactical discovery. It was an education in the nature of modern warfare. The Germans had fought hard, but the Americans had fought smarter by producing and organizing at a scale their enemies could scarcely comprehend. For the audience, it is a dramatic truth. While courage and training matter, in industrial warfare, abundance often wins the day. Germany's realization at Hansfeld was a harsh awakening that one small depot could reveal the unimaginable might of the United States. By the end of that day, the lesson was clear. The Germans had captured fuel they thought would save their offensive. Instead, it highlighted how outmatched they truly were. The Americans' ability to produce, store, and move fuel in overwhelming quantities ensured that the war was already being won long before bullets were fired. For Piper and his men, it was a moment of awe, fear, and clarity, a stark reminder that in this war, the real power was not in their tanks but in the factories, pipelines, and trucks of the United States. As Colonel Hans Piper and his men marveled at the captured fuel at Hansfeld, the bigger picture slowly became clear. This wasn't just a lucky find or a single stroke of American fortune. It was a glimpse into a supply machine so vast and precise that it made Germany's struggles seem almost trivial. The United States was not only producing enormous amounts of fuel, tanks, and ammunition, but it was also delivering them to the front lines at speeds and volumes that Germany could never hope to match. At the heart of this incredible system was the Red Ball Express, a convoy network of thousands of trucks running almost non-stop across France and Belgium. These convoys moved fuel, food, ammunition, and other vital supplies directly to the front lines, ensuring that American units were always ready for combat. Trucks departed in waves, following carefully planned routes, and drivers worked day and night. No matter how far the battlefield shifted, supplies seemed to appear almost magically, fueling every offensive and keeping soldiers equipped and confident. Alongside the Red Ball Express, pipelines pumped fuel inland from ports like Cherbourg. These pipelines were engineering marvels, silently moving millions of gallons daily, directly to storage points near combat zones. Unlike the Germans, who had to ration their precious fuel and depend on vulnerable supply lines, the Americans had built a system designed to absorb losses, delays, and attacks without faltering. If a convoy was destroyed or delayed, the pipeline kept flowing. If a depot was captured or burned, trucks from another route filled the gap. This redundancy created a sense of inexhaustible resources that German commanders could scarcely imagine. For German soldiers, the contrast was staggering. Piper's men had seen firsthand the difference between scarcity and abundance. In the Ardennes, they carefully measured every drop, planned every mile, and still risked running out. Meanwhile, the Americans didn't just have enough fuel, they had so much that they could afford to destroy millions of gallons to prevent the enemy from seizing it. A single American battalion could consume in hours what the Germans counted as months of supply. It was a scale of logistics that made tactical skill nearly irrelevant. The psychological impact of this abundance was devastating. German soldiers, who had prided themselves on efficiency and resourcefulness, suddenly realized that the Americans operated on a level of industrial power they could never match. Supplies arrived faster than they could capture them. Pipelines fed front lines without interruption, and the Red Ball Express ensured that no American unit was ever left stranded. The Americans weren't just fighting, they were flooding the battlefield with resources, creating an invisible advantage that went far beyond bullets and bravery. For the audience, it's easy to imagine the scene. A German Tiger tank crew marvels at the captured fuel, only to realize that it's a tiny fraction of what the Americans have. Trucks loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations moved day and night along carefully maintained routes, while pipelines hum quietly in the background. Every mile of advance by the Germans is matched by American forces replenishing what's used, ready to strike again. The war is no longer a battle of tactics alone. It's a battle of industrial capacity, and America holds the overwhelming advantage. This relentless supply chain allowed the Allies to sustain operations during the harsh winter of 1944, even in the face of fierce German resistance. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft kept moving. Soldiers remained fed, armed, and fueled. Every captured depot, every abandoned stockpile only reinforced the lesson. No single German offensive, no matter how well planned or well executed, could overcome a system designed to deliver millions of gallons daily. Colonel Piper understood this starkly. The 50,000 gallons they had captured at Hansfeld was a mere drop in the ocean. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to produce, transport, and deliver fuel at rates the Germans could not comprehend. The Red Ball Express and the pipeline network were the silent engines behind victory, the unseen weapons that turned industrial might into battlefield dominance. German units could fight bravely, maneuver skillfully, and capture depots, but they were always chasing a scale of resources that America had mastered. By the end of that day, the lesson was undeniable. American logistics weren't just support, they were a weapon. The Germans could count their leaders and ration carefully, but the Allies could move oceans of fuel at will. Every mile the Americans advanced was backed by an industrial guarantee that the Germans could not match. The war, it seemed, was being won long before bullets were fired, in factories, pipelines, and on endless highways of supply trucks. As Colonel Piper's men moved deeper into Belgium, the enormity of American abundance began to hit them in ways they had never anticipated. At Hansfeld and other captured depots, They had already seen enough fuel to power their entire offensive for weeks, yet it was nothing compared to the resources the Americans had at their disposal. For the Germans, it was shocking to watch soldiers casually using gasoline to heat their tents or warm their food. Every barrel of fuel was precious in the German army, rationed with meticulous care. Yet here it was being burned without a second thought. Chocolate, a rare and treasured commodity for German soldiers, was being fed to dogs. Soldiers on the front lines had gone months without such luxuries, scrimping and saving every bite. Yet the Americans treated it as common. The sheer scale of consumption and the apparent carelessness was almost incomprehensible. For German soldiers, who had prided themselves on discipline and efficiency, this was a cultural and tactical shock. It wasn't just about fuel or rations, it was about the mindset behind them. The Americans weren't worried about running out. They weren't measuring every drop. They weren't scrambling to keep their machines moving. They had enough to waste, and they did. This abundance had a direct and devastating effect on morale. German troops who had been trained to believe in their superiority suddenly realized they were up against something far greater than skill or courage. The illusions of invincibility, drilled into them by propaganda and years of battlefield experience, began to crumble. Seeing the Americans burn, waste, and still advance made them question everything they had been taught about strategy, efficiency, and the nature of the enemy. It was one thing to hear reports of American production, was another to witness it firsthand. Private Ernst Kara, one of Piper's soldiers, later recalled how bewildering it was to watch American convoys and depots. They saw trucks moving supplies constantly, fuel being destroyed to prevent capture, and soldiers living in conditions that the Germans could only dream of. Every encounter reinforced a growing realization. They were not just outnumbered in tanks and men, they were outmatched in every resource that mattered. What Germany considered essential for survival, the fuel, the food, the ammunition, was being casually treated as expendable by the American. This psychological shock wasn't limited to small units. Officers reported widespread despair as their men questioned the feasibility of continuing their operations. Generals who had planned offensives based on careful calculations of fuel and rations now saw the futility in their efforts. Even elite SS units, trained for ruthless efficiency and equipped with powerful tanks, felt the crushing weight of inadequacy. No amount of skill or bravery could overcome an enemy whose advantage was measured, not just in numbers of weapons, but in the scale of logistical power behind every move. For the audience, it's easy to picture the scene. German soldiers huddled around their empty tanks, staring at mountains of fuel they could barely believe existed. They saw Americans laughing, eating, and working in conditions their own troops could only envy. Fuel that could have powered a German division for weeks was being burned in minutes. Supplies that could have saved countless lives were casually discarded. Each observation chipped away at the German belief that they could control the battlefield. The psychological impact extended beyond morale. It reshaped how German soldiers thought about the war itself. They realized that even if they captured depots, even if they fought bravely and tactically, they could never match the scale of the American supply machine. The war was no longer just about bullets, tanks, or strategy. It was about industrial might and the ability to sustain it continuously. America's capacity to produce and deliver vast quantities of fuel and supplies made German calculations irrelevant. By the end of December 1944, the lesson was undeniable. The Germans were fighting an enemy whose wealth of resources rendered courage and planning insufficient. Seeing the Americans so rich in fuel, food, and materials broke the illusion of invincibility. The psychological blow was as significant as any battlefield defeat. German soldiers understood they were up against an opponent who could literally burn millions of gallons of fuel to prevent capture, while still moving forward unimpeded. It wasn't just a war of weapons, it was a war of abundance, and America held the advantage in every sense. The Germans had trained for precision and scarcity, but the Americans fought with oceans of resources. Watching it unfold firsthand, they understood something profound. No battle, no matter how skillfully fought, could overcome industrial power and logistical mastery. It was a lesson that would haunt them for the rest of the war and beyond. By December 1944, the Germans were running on desperation as much as strategy. The Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was supposed to be Germany's last great gamble, a chance to strike the Allies and change the course of the war. But behind the scenes, the plan was already cracking. Germany's fuel supplies were critically low. They didn't have enough to power their tanks, trucks, or aircraft for the scale of the attack they were planning. Every calculation, every map, every timetable relied on one risky assumption: that they would capture enough American fuel along the way to keep the offensive moving. Colonel Hans Piper and his elite SS units were briefed before the operation. They were told they would have fuel for the initial advance, but it wouldn't be enough to reach their objectives. It was expected that capturing American depots would make up the difference. In other words, success depended on winning resources from the enemy rather than relying on what they already had. This wasn't just risky, it was a gamble with no safety net. German planners believed they could outfight the Americans, but they didn't fully grasp how vast the US supply system truly was. From the start, the German offensive ran into trouble. Narrow Ardennes roads slowed their advance, forcing tanks and trucks to move in single file. Engines idled, burning precious fuel, and unexpected resistance from small American units caused delays. Every hour cost them more fuel than they could afford to lose. When they finally reached Hansfeld, the first American fuel depot, Piper's men discovered 50,000 gallons of gasoline. It seemed like a miracle. They celebrated as if they had found treasure. But the truth hit quickly. That amount, which might have fueled their entire operation for weeks, was nothing to the Americans. It was less than a single American armored division used in just 2 days. The gamble that German high command had relied on to capture American fuel and keep advancing was already doomed. Every calculation they had made was based on scarcity. Every plan assumed they would need to scrounge and stretch their supplies. But the Americans were swimming in fuel, supplies, and logistical support. They didn't just survive shortages, they created a system where burning millions of gallons to deny it to the enemy was routine. Germans couldn't even comprehend such abundance, let alone compete with it. As Piper's units pushed forward, the reality became even more crushing. American forces were ready to destroy their own fuel to prevent capture, which meant even the depots the Germans reached didn't provide long-term support. At Stavello, over 2 million gallons were deliberately set on fire by American engineers. Similar scenes were repeated at multiple locations. The Germans were chasing a moving target, dependent on resources that were not only abundant, but often deliberately denied. For German soldiers, the implications were devastating. The Ardennes Offensive was not just a risky attack, it was an operation doomed from the beginning. Their high-tech tanks, elite troops, and careful planning were meaningless without fuel to power the engines. The very strategy they relied on revealed their fundamental weakness. Germany could fight battles, but they couldn't sustain a war against an industrial superpower. For the audience, it's easy to picture the scene. Elite units trained for months, tanks gleaming in the cold Belgian sun, officers planning every maneuver only to realize that their success hinged on capturing supplies from an enemy who could afford to burn what they couldn't use. Every expectation of victory collided with a harsh truth. The Germans were fighting not just the American army, but the might of American production. By the time the offensive began, the dice were already loaded against them. Germany's gamble on captured fuel wasn't just risky. It was a strategic miscalculation that made defeat inevitable. They had no margin for error. Every misstep, every delay, every loss of fuel brought them closer to failure. And they did. The Ardennes Offensive consumed what little resources Germany had, leaving troops stranded, vehicles abandoned, and the entire plan in ruins. The lesson is clear for modern audiences. Logistics and production matter as much, if not more, than bravery or tactics in warfare. Germany gambled on enemy supplies they couldn't control, and the result was total disaster. They thought they could fight and capture enough to win, but in reality, they were already losing before a single bullet was fired. The Ardennes Offensive is a stark reminder that in industrial warfare, abundance beats skill, and preparation beats daring. As December 1944 wore on, the consequences of Germany's fuel shortage became painfully clear on the battlefield. Tiger tanks, Panthers, and half-tracks that had once symbolized fearsome power now sat idle along narrow Ardennes roads. Engines cooled, turrets remained unmanned, and the elite SS units that had begun the offensive with confidence were frozen in place. The enemy wasn't advancing artillery or massed infantry, it was something far simpler, and yet more devastating: the lack of fuel. Imagine the scene. Column after column of tanks, stretching through snowy forests, engines silent, tracks immobile. Vehicles that could have crushed resistance now became mere metal, monuments to miscalculation. Soldiers who had trained relentlessly, veterans who had survived the brutal Eastern Front, stared at their empty tanks in disbelief. They had come to Belgium, expecting to strike a decisive blow. But now they were trapped by their own logistical failure. Every hour wasted idling in the cold cost precious gallons that they could not afford to lose. The Americans, on the other hand, moved like ghosts through the chaos. While German forces struggled to advance 20 miles, U.S. supply trucks rolled unhindered, delivering fuel, ammunition, and rations at a pace Germany could scarcely imagine. The contrast was staggering. German soldiers who prided themselves on discipline and efficiency could not comprehend how their opponents could waste fuel with such abandon while still maintaining operational superiority. While the Germans counted every liter, the Americans burned millions strategically to deny it to the enemy. The Germans were running on rationed hope, and it was evaporating with every passing mile. By mid-December, the operational picture for Germany was dire. Piper's spearhead units had managed to capture 50 gallons at Hansfeld, an amount that seemed miraculous at first. Yet, within hours, it became clear that this was barely enough to sustain their immediate operations. Tigers, notorious for guzzling fuel, drained the supply in mere hours, leaving other units stranded behind them. Half-tracks and support vehicles, critical for logistics and communications, were abandoned as well. Each immobile vehicle created choke points along the roads, preventing other units from moving forward and further compounding the problem. The psychological effect on German troops was devastating. They had prepared for a high-stakes battle, but now survival was dictated not by skill or courage, but by whether a single fuel truck could reach them. Panic simmered just beneath the surface. Officers shouted orders, but there was little they could do as columns ground to a halt. Engineers frantically tried to siphon or redistribute what little fuel remained, but it was not enough. The most advanced army in the world, equipped with fearsome tanks and battle-hardened troops, was reduced to crawling through the Ardennes like a frozen machine. Meanwhile, American soldiers observed from positions well behind the front lines. They watched as German forces became increasingly immobilized, vehicles abandoned in the snow, engines smoldering, crews forced to march on foot. These moments highlighted an uncomfortable truth. The Germans were losing not because of superior firepower or tactics, but because they could not sustain their forces logistically. The enemy that had once seemed invincible now looked desperate and vulnerable. Even minor skirmishes revealed the staggering advantage of American logistics. A small patrol could hold up an entire German column for hours, not through sheer firepower but by exploiting stalled vehicles and blocked roads. Every empty tank or immobilized half-track became a barrier, a warning of the deeper weakness that plagued the German offensive. Soldiers began to understand that no tactical brilliance could overcome the stark reality of scarcity. For the audience, the image is unforgettable. Elite German forces, tanks gleaming in the winter sunlight, suddenly froze in place, while Americans moved freely, resupplied, and even destroyed fuel to prevent its capture. The battlefield itself became a lesson. Wars are won not by individual bravery alone, but by the ability to move, supply, and sustain forces continuously. In the Ardennes, the Germans discovered that even their most powerful weapons were useless without fuel, and the entire offensive collapsed before it could reach its potential. By the end of December 1944, the evidence was clear. The Ardennes Offensive, once a symbol of German might, had become a cautionary tale of what happens when industrial capacity and logistics dominate the battlefield. Tanks were abandoned, vehicles immobilized, and thousands of soldiers trapped in the snow, all while the enemy surged forward with resources to spare. The lesson resonates today. In modern warfare, abundance and preparation often decide victory, long before the first bullet is fired. While German tanks stalled and soldiers froze in the Ardennes, the American war machine moved with precision and power that seemed almost unstoppable. The secret wasn't just numbers or firepower, it was efficiency. Every vehicle, every piece of equipment, every drop of fuel was part of a system so well-oiled that it became a weapon in itself. Imagine columns of Sherman tanks, trucks, and artillery moving like perfectly synchronized chess pieces across the battlefield. Each unit knew its place, its purpose, and its schedule, allowing the Americans to respond to the chaos around them with speed and control that Germany could not match. Standardization was a key part of this efficiency. Unlike the Germans, who had a bewildering mix of captured and domestically produced vehicles requiring different parts, fuels, and maintenance, American vehicles were uniform. A Sherman tank could be repaired anywhere, using parts that fit any other Sherman. Trucks were interchangeable, and engines ran on the same grade of fuel. Maintenance crews could swap components in minutes, keeping the machinery moving. German soldiers, by contrast, had to juggle different types of tanks, each with unique fuel requirements and delicate engines. A captured American jerrycan could even damage German Maybach engines, leaving troops both frustrated and immobilized. Fuel efficiency itself was a strategic advantage. German Tigers consumed massive amounts of gasoline, up to 2.5 gallons per mile, while American Shermans and trucks were far more economical. American supply convoys could transport troops and equipment over long distances without running dry. In the Ardennes, this meant that while Germans struggled to advance 20 miles before running out of fuel, Americans could redeploy entire divisions at the same time, resupply units at the front, and even destroy fuel reserves to deny them to the enemy, all without breaking stride. Efficiency had become a force multiplier, turning logistics into a decisive weapon. The Americans also leveraged well-planned supply networks to sustain this efficiency. Systems like the Red Ball Express and pipeline networks ensured a constant flow of fuel, ammunition, and rations to the front lines. Convoys ran on strict schedules, trucks were color-coded for routes, and engineers repaired roads and bridges overnight to maintain the flow. This logistical precision allowed commanders to focus on tactics and strategy, confident that their forces would have everything they needed. German officers could only watch as entire armies moved with fluidity, understanding too late that no amount of courage or planning could make up for scarcity. The contrast on the battlefield was stark. While Germans abandoned tanks and half-tracks, Americans pushed forward, combining manpower and machinery seamlessly. Where a German column was stuck in snow, an American convoy would pass unimpeded. Where German officers struggled to coordinate forces, American generals moved troops like pieces on a board, anticipating obstacles, exploiting opportunities, and keeping the initiative firmly in their hands. Efficiency itself became a weapon, outmatching tanks, artillery, and even elite troops. Even small details reflected this advantage. American crews wasted little time refueling or repairing, performing tasks that might take German units hours in a fraction of the time. Rations and supplies were standardized, reducing confusion and ensuring that soldiers stayed fed, rested, and ready for combat. In effect, the Americans were fighting with an industrial rhythm, a predictable and powerful momentum that Germany could not disrupt. The psychological impact of this efficiency on German soldiers cannot be overstated. They had expected to face superior skill, not superior organization. Seeing Americans move freely while their own columns ground to a halt shattered confidence and morale. The realization was chilling. The enemy's greatest weapon was not their guns or tanks, but their ability to keep every piece of the war machine moving without pause. For the audience, the lesson is clear and striking. In modern warfare, victory often goes to those who can supply, repair, and maneuver faster than the opponent. German courage and tactical brilliance could not overcome American efficiency. Standardized vehicles, streamlined supply lines, and careful resource management became a silent but unstoppable force. In the Ardennes, efficiency truly proved more powerful than tanks, and the battlefield belonged to those who understood that production and logistics are as decisive as any weapon in a soldier's arsenal. By late 1944, the sheer scale of American production was staggering, almost unimaginable to the German soldiers who stumbled across their depots. While Germany scraped together enough fuel and machinery to barely move, America was building oceans of war machines, aircraft, and petroleum supplies, flooding the battlefield with resources that Germany could only dream of. The numbers themselves tell a story of overwhelming power. In 1944 alone, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil, while Germany, even including synthetic production in captured Romanian fields, produced just 33 million barrels. That means America had more than 50 times the fuel Germany could muster. It's no wonder that a single American fuel depot containing 50,000 gallons seemed like a miracle to the Germans. Yet it was nothing to the Americans themselves. Tanks and armored vehicles followed a similar pattern. American factories produced 88,410 tanks during the war, compared to Germany's 46,857. That's nearly double the number. And each tank was backed by a supply chain capable of keeping it running for weeks of combat. Aircraft production told the same story. By the end of the war, America had manufactured 324,750 planes, while Germany produced 119,970. Every day, new aircraft rolled off assembly lines, ready to be flown into the skies over Europe. German soldiers, even the most elite, could not compete with this relentless industrial tide. The advantage didn't stop with numbers. American production emphasized efficiency, standardization, and speed. Tanks, planes, and trucks were built to work together, with interchangeable parts and engines designed to run reliably on abundant high-quality fuel. Meanwhile, German forces struggled with a chaotic mix of vehicles, synthetic fuels, and maintenance problems. Their tanks guzzled fuel at alarming rates, spare parts were scarce, and logistics were fragile. One captured American jerrycan could even harm German engines, leaving the enemy's elite units immobilized. This disparity in production created a psychological, as well as a tactical advantage. German soldiers realized that every depot they captured, every fuel shipment they seized, was only a drop in the ocean compared to the resources the Americans could produce and destroy at will. In the Ardennes, even as Piper's men celebrated finding 50,000 gallons of gasoline, they were soon faced with the grim reality that the Americans could destroy millions of gallons. To deny them, then replace it without missing a beat. Every calculation they had made about fuel and supplies was suddenly meaningless in the face of this industrial power. Aircraft alone could demonstrate the scale of this advantage. A single day's operations consumed more fuel than Germany could allocate for an entire month. P-47 fighters and B-26 bombers burned thousands of gallons per hour. Yet American logistics ensured they always had enough to fly sorties that disrupted German movements and supply lines. German ground forces, on the other hand, had to ration every gallon, often abandoning tanks or artillery simply because there was no fuel to move them. Even the smallest supplies highlighted the gap. Where Germans counted every liter, Americans casually burned fuel for warmth, chocolate for dogs, and artillery fire for celebration. This abundance wasn't wasteful. It was deliberate, a display of a system so massive that scarcity was impossible. Every captured German soldier, every officer witnessing these stockpiles, understood the magnitude of the imbalance. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting an industrial juggernaut. For the audience, the lesson is striking. In modern warfare, production determines power. Courage, skill, and strategy can only go so far when one side has oceans of fuel, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of thousands of aircraft ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Germany may have had elite soldiers and brilliant generals, but they could not compete with the relentless output of American industry. In the Ardennes, in Hansfeld, and across the European battlefields, it became clear that victory belonged to those who could manufacture and supply more than the enemy could ever consume. America didn't just fight, it built, supplied, and outproduced. Germany, turning industrial capacity into the most decisive weapon of all. For the German soldiers in December 1944, the discovery at Hansfeld was both a miracle and a shock. Colonel Hans Piper and his elite SS men stumbled upon 50,000 gallons of American fuel, neatly stacked in jerry cans as far as the eye could see. At first, it felt like the tide had turned in their favor. For a moment, they imagined their offensive could continue, that their tanks would roll again, and that they might achieve the victories their superiors demanded. But that hope quickly dissolved as reality set in. The Germans were trained to respect fuel as the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, and even this massive stash was only a tiny fraction of what the Americans could produce, destroy, and replace at will. Piper's men soon realized the cruel truth. The Ardennes Offensive, already risky and stretched to its limits, was designed on assumptions that relied on capturing enemy supplies. The German high command believed they could seize enough fuel to sustain their advance. What they didn't account for was the sheer scale of American logistics. The Americans didn't just store fuel, they built a system capable of delivering millions of gallons daily. When Piper saw the rows of jerry cans, he understood for the first time the impossible odds they faced. A single depot, which seemed like a treasure, was nothing to an enemy who could afford to burn millions to deny it to the Germans. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. Soldiers who had survived years on the Eastern Front, who had endured bitter winters, hunger, and relentless combat, were suddenly confronted with an enemy whose resources made their sacrifices seem trivial. They watched American soldiers casually use gasoline to warm themselves, feed chocolate to their dogs, and fire artillery in celebration, where Germans had rationed every drop. The Americans discarded what they didn't immediately need. It was a level of abundance that shattered German morale. Letters, diaries, and testimonies from German soldiers revealed the depth of this realization. They wrote about how the Americans could move freely while their own tanks sat idle, how they could destroy fuel depots without blinking an eye, and how every captured supply was a fraction of the enemy's capability. One soldier described staring at the piles of jerry cans and thinking, "We captured what seemed miraculous," only to realize it was nothing. This sentiment was repeated across the Ardennes as German troops encountered depots, supply lines, and pipelines that rendered their own planning irrelevant. The contrast between scarcity and abundance became impossible to ignore. German generals had meticulously calculated fuel requirements, rationed every liter, and ordered tanks to operate in single file to conserve resources. Meanwhile, American logistics flowed like a river. The Red Ball Express and pipeline systems delivered millions of gallons of fuel daily, keeping armored divisions moving and aircraft in the air. Every time a German unit captured fuel, they faced the bitter knowledge that it was a small drop in a massive ocean. The enemy's reserves were not just large, they were virtually limitless compared to Germany's dwindling stores. This stark reality transformed the battlefield. German troops who had once believed in tactical superiority began to doubt whether the war could be won at all. They realized that no matter how well-trained, disciplined, or courageous they were fighting an industrial giant. Every maneuver, every attack, and every calculated risk was overshadowed by a logistical system the Germans could not comprehend, let alone match. Even their most elite units could not overcome the relentless tide of American production. For the audience, the lesson is clear. In modern warfare, resources and logistics are as decisive as courage and skill. The German soldiers' shock at Hansfeld reveals that victory is not determined by bravery alone. They captured what seemed miraculous, only to learn that it meant nothing against the sheer abundance of their enemy. This moment in the Ardennes was more than a tactical setback. It was a revelation that the war was already slipping from Germany's grasp, not because of firepower alone, but because of the industrial machine that fueled every American soldier, tank, and plane. When we think of World War II, images of soldiers charging into battle, tanks smashing through defenses, and dogfights in the sky come to mind. But by 1944, it was no longer just courage, skill, or strategy that decided victories. The real battlefield was hidden behind the front lines, in factories, refineries, and supply depots. The war was increasingly a contest of industrial power, and the Germans discovered this the hard way in the Ardennes. Colonel Hans Piper's encounter at Hansfeld made it painfully clear. Capturing 50,000 gallons of fuel seemed like a game-changing victory. Yet it was barely a drop in the ocean compared to what the Americans could produce, move, and if needed, destroy. German soldiers who had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front suddenly faced a harsh reality. No amount of bravery could make up for the gap in industrial output. Every tank, truck, plane, and artillery shell required fuel, spare parts, and ammunition, and Germany simply could not keep up. The United States, on the other hand, had mobilized its industrial might like no nation before. By 1944, America produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil, compared to Germany's 33 million barrels. Including synthetic fuels, the U.S. built tanks, planes, and ships at a pace Germany could not dream of matching. Every day, American logistics flowed seamlessly to the front lines, supported by pipelines, trucks, and massive supply chains. The Red Ball Express alone delivered thousands of tons of fuel daily, ensuring that armored divisions never stalled and that air support could fly without hesitation. This overwhelming production advantage was not just about quantity. It was about reliability, efficiency, and planning. American vehicles were standardized, parts were interchangeable, and fuel was delivered with precision. German forces, by contrast, faced constant shortages and logistical nightmares. They had to ration every liter of gasoline, manage diverse vehicles with incompatible engines, and gamble that captured supplies would arrive in time. In every confrontation, the Americans could afford to waste resources, while the Germans treated every gallon like gold. The impact on the battlefield was undeniable. Even when German units displayed exceptional skill or courage, their efforts were undermined by a lack of fuel and supplies. Tanks were abandoned, troops marched without support, and offensive stalled not because of enemy fire, but because the industrial machine of the United States simply overwhelmed them. It was a reality that German commanders could not ignore, and soldiers at every level felt the crushing difference. The story of the Ardennes is a perfect example. German soldiers believed they could seize American fuel depots to sustain their advance, only to discover that the Americans had built reserves far beyond what Germany could hope to capture. Fuel burned in controlled explosions to deny it to the enemy. Supply lines delivered millions of gallons per day, and pipelines carried resources across hundreds of miles. The sheer scale of production made German planning irrelevant. No bravery, no tactical brilliance could overcome a foe who could replace everything faster than it was destroyed. For the audience, the lesson is clear and dramatic. World War II was not only fought with guns and tanks. It was fought in factories, refineries, and on supply routes. The outcome of battles, and ultimately the war, hinged on which side could keep its soldiers fueled, armed, and moving. The Germans learned too late that their enemy's ability to produce, transport, and even destroy resources at will was a weapon more decisive than any tank or gun. The war was a battle of machines as much as men, of pipelines as much as infantry, and of logistics as much as leadership. By the time Hans Peiper's tanks rolled through the Ardennes, the writing was on the wall. Industrial power had already decided the outcome. Bravery could inspire, but it could not overcome the might of an enemy whose factories, refineries, and pipelines turned war into a question of supply, not just strategy. Every jerrycan captured, every depot seized, every daring maneuver was ultimately overshadowed by the simple fact that America could build, move, and replace far more than Germany ever could. The lesson echoes beyond history. In modern warfare, production and logistics are as lethal as any weapon. Factories, pipelines, and supply chains became the hidden generals of World War II, shaping victory long before soldiers fired a single shot. As Colonel Hans Peiper stood among the captured American fuel at Hansfeld, something shifted in his mind. At first, there was relief and triumph. 50,000 gallons of gasoline seemed like a miracle, a lifeline for his stalled tanks, and a chance to keep the Ardennes offensive alive. His men cheered, refueled their vehicles, and felt that familiar surge of hope that soldiers cling to in the chaos of battle. But as Peiper surveyed the depot, the reality of the situation began to settle in. It wasn't just the sheer quantity of fuel that stunned him. It was the scale of what he had stumbled into. These 50,000 gallons, which to him represented salvation, were merely a fraction of what the Americans could produce, move, and if needed, destroy. Peiper read the shipping manifests and delivery records, and the numbers painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Fuel had traveled thousands of miles from Texas to New York, crossed the Atlantic, passed through England, and been trucked to Belgium, all in a matter of weeks. The efficiency and magnitude were staggering. It was an industrial machine beyond German comprehension. Peiper began to understand the truth in the starkest way possible. The war was already slipping out of Germany's hands. While his soldiers celebrated a temporary windfall, the Americans could pour millions of gallons into the front lines at a pace his entire division could never hope to match. Every calculation he made, every map he examined, showed the same harsh reality. The Ardennes offensive was a gamble built on hope and captured supplies, not on sustainable logistics. And hope alone could not win a war against such overwhelming industrial power. In diaries and later interviews, Peiper reflected on the psychological impact of that moment. One account recalls him silently crumpling a shipping manifest after reading the details twice. There was no shouting, no despair, just a profound realization. The Americans had resources that made Germany's reserves seem microscopic. They could afford to burn fuel, to destroy depots, to replace tanks and artillery with barely a pause. To Peiper, it was no longer a question of battlefield tactics. It was a numbers game that Germany had already lost. For the soldiers under his command, the lesson was just as crushing. They had trained, fought, and survived on the belief that skill, courage, and determination could level the field. Yet here, in the cold morning light, they saw that the enemy had something far greater: abundance. Gasoline used for warmth, chocolate fed to dogs, trucks and tanks always ready and supplied. The war was no longer simply a fight for territory. It was a confrontation with an enemy who could replace, resupply, and overwhelm endlessly. Peiper's understanding spread through his unit like a quiet, heavy fog. The Ardennes offensive became not just a military challenge, but a reckoning with reality. Every decision he made afterward was shaped by this recognition of futility. Tanks were rationed, engines shut off to conserve fuel, and every captured depot became a temporary lifeline rather than a decisive victory. Even the daring and the brave could not change the truth that his enemy operated on a scale that made German scarcity irrelevant for the audience. This moment connects emotionally because it shows that victory is often determined far from the front lines. Piper's personal realization embodies the lesson of industrial warfare. Courage and strategy are vital, but without the backbone of production, logistics, and resources, even the best trained soldiers cannot win. One officer's dawning awareness revealed the inevitable fate of an entire army, a truth that no heroics could alter. In that quiet recognition, Piper glimpsed the larger story of the war. The Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, and the countless skirmishes and campaigns were shaped not just by skill on the battlefield, but by the unmatched industrial might of the United States. Factories, pipelines, and trucks dictated the pace and success of operations. Piper's moment of clarity was more than personal. It symbolized the final, unassailable reality for Germany. The war was being lost before a single shot was fired. His insight leaves a chilling lesson. In industrial warfare, numbers and logistics often matter more than bravery or training. As Piper came to understand, the German soldier's courage was heroic, but it could not overcome an enemy whose abundance made scarcity irrelevant, and that realization, bitter and unavoidable, marked the beginning of the end. The Ardennes Offensive, or the Battle of the Bulge as it is often called, left a mark far beyond the frozen forests of Belgium. While the immediate story is one of tanks stalled, soldiers running dry, and desperate maneuvers, the long-term consequences for Germany were even more profound. For the German military, the battle was a harsh lesson in the limits of tactics when faced with an opponent whose industrial capacity dwarfed their own. After December 1944, the German high command could no longer ignore the reality of their fuel shortages and production deficiencies. Every offensive from that point on was constrained by what little resources remained. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft that could have changed the tide were sitting idle, immobilized not by skill or bravery of the enemy, but because there was nothing to power them. The Ardennes became a turning point in German military thinking, a brutal acknowledgement that the war could not be won on the battlefield alone. Historians and military analysts have repeatedly pointed to the Ardennes as a symbol of industrial supremacy. While German officers had relied on audacity, surprise, and tactical skill, the Allies relied on factories, pipelines, and a relentless supply chain. The Red Ball Express, the fuel pipelines across France, and the daily deliveries of millions of gallons of gasoline were not just logistics. They were weapons in their own right. The lesson was clear. Industrial power could achieve what soldiers alone could not. The psychological impact extended far beyond the battlefield. German soldiers and officers carried the realization that no amount of courage or training could make up for the sheer scale of American production. Letters, diaries, and testimonies reveal a mixture of awe, despair, and disbelief. Watching Americans casually destroy fuel reserves rather than risk them falling into enemy hands highlighted the futility of Germany's strategies. It wasn't just about losing territory. It was about being outproduced and outsupplied on every level. For the Allies, the Ardennes reinforced the importance of logistical planning. The ability to move troops, fuel, and supplies efficiently became a cornerstone of military doctrine. Lessons learned during this battle influenced strategies in Europe and beyond, proving that a well-fed, well-supplied army could operate effectively even under harsh conditions. The contrast between the American approach and the German scarcity-driven operations became a case study in military academies around the world. The battle also shaped post-war thinking about warfare in an industrialized age. Modern conflicts are rarely decided by bravery alone. Armies, historians have argued, are ultimately reflections of the societies that produce and sustain them. The Ardennes demonstrated that the real front lines often extend far beyond the trenches and forests into factories, refineries, and logistics networks. The ability to sustain and replenish forces can outweigh any tactical advantage gained on the battlefield. For audiences today, the Ardennes serves as a striking lesson in scale and strategy. One can imagine the shock of German officers standing among stacks of fuel, realizing that what seemed miraculous to them was trivial to their enemy. That moment encapsulates the broader truth. In a world of industrial warfare, abundance beats skill when skill has no fuel to move. The legacy of the Ardennes is thus twofold. For Germany, it was a story of missed opportunities, strategic miscalculations, and the harsh reality of fighting an industrial giant. For the Allies, it was proof that careful planning, resource management, and relentless production could turn the tide of war decisively. The battle became a symbol of industrial supremacy, a reminder that wars are often won not just by soldiers on the front lines, but by the factories, pipelines, and supply chains behind them. Even decades later, historians and military enthusiasts visit the Ardennes, study the abandoned tanks, and read the reports of fuel shortages to understand this lesson. The images of Tiger tanks halted for lack of gasoline, juxtaposed with American supply convoys delivering millions of gallons daily, tell a story that goes beyond tactics and heroism. It tells a story of numbers, logistics, and the overwhelming power of industrial might. In the end, the Ardennes was more than a battle. It was a revelation. It showed that victory in modern warfare is built not only on courage and skill, but on the ability to outproduce, outsupply, and outlast your opponent. The legacy remains clear. In the war of machines, factories often decide the outcome long before the first shot is fired. As the snow settled over the Ardennes, the scene was almost surreal. German Tiger tanks, once symbols of mechanized power and fear, sat abandoned in frozen fields. Half-tracks, artillery, and armored vehicles were left to rust or were deliberately destroyed by their own crews. The soldiers who had trained for years, who had braved the Eastern Front and survived impossible odds, were now defeated not by bullets, not by American firepower, but by scarcity. Fuel, something so basic, had become the deciding factor. Colonel Hans Piper and his elite SS unit had pushed forward with determination, capturing American depots and celebrating what seemed like incredible victories. 50,000 gallons of fuel appeared to be a miracle, yet even this treasure was nothing compared to the daily abundance of the Allied forces. Across Belgium, Americans were not just supplying their front lines, they were creating reserves, building pipelines, and delivering millions of gallons of fuel with ease. The contrast could not have been starker. The Germans fought desperately for every liter, while the Allies could afford to waste millions. This was the brutal lesson of the Ardennes. Courage, skill, and tactical brilliance mattered less than the ability to keep machines moving and armies supplied. The German offensive had been planned with audacity and precision, but it ignored one unassailable truth. In a war of modern armies, logistics can decide the outcome before a single shot is fired. Every abandoned tank, every immobilized vehicle, every frustrated soldier reflected the unstoppable power of industrial warfare. The Americans demonstrated that victory comes not only from bravery, but from production. Factories, refineries, pipelines, and convoys became the hidden front lines. The Red Ball Express trucks rumbled day and night, supplying the front with fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Pipelines pumped oil across Europe at a rate that the Germans could scarcely imagine. While Germany counted liters and rationed fuel, America burned millions to deny them to the enemy, a strategy both practical and psychological. By the time the Ardennes offensive ended, the numbers told a story as clear as any battlefield report. German forces were decimated, tanks abandoned, vehicles destroyed, soldiers exhausted. The American forces, meanwhile, moved like clockwork, their supply chains allowing flexibility, resilience, and overwhelming advantage. The war, in many ways, was already decided. By the factories humming back in the United States, the Ardennes revealed that industrial power could outmatch any tactical genius or elite soldier. For Piper, the personal realization was devastating. The man who had once celebrated captured fuel depots now understood the futility of their efforts. The supplies that had seemed miraculous to his eyes were insignificant to the Americans. The war was lost, not because of combat failures, but because the enemy's logistical system was simply beyond comprehension. This lesson echoed through every German unit that witnessed the Ardennes firsthand. The illusion of control shattered, morale collapsed, and the final chapters of the Third Reich's military campaign were written not in battles won, but in resources outproduced. For today's audience, the Ardennes offers a striking perspective on modern warfare. It reminds us that the most powerful weapons are not always the ones that roar across battlefields. Often, it is the factories that hum, the pipelines that flow, and the relentless systems of supply that determine victory. Tanks may be powerful, soldiers brave, and generals brilliant, but without fuel, ammunition, and provisions, they are powerless. So when we look back at the Ardennes, the image that lingers is not of victory or defeat, but of scale. German tanks frozen in fields, soldiers exhausted by scarcity, and the overwhelming abundance of an industrialized army that moved like a tide across Europe. The Ardennes stands as a lesson for all time. In WWII, oceans of fuel and relentless industry were deadlier than bullets. Logistics, production, and planning won the war long before the first shot was fired, and no act of courage could overturn the power of industry unleashed. The Ardennes reminds us that wars are not only fought on the front lines, they are fought in factories, refineries, and supply chains. The might of an army is measured not just by its weapons or training, but by its ability to sustain, resupply, and overwhelm the enemy with sheer scale. As the snow melts over those abandoned tanks, the lesson remains: in the modern age, abundance is the deadliest weapon of all.